There's a misconception that the great storms of life happen when you're young. You survive them, you rebuild, and you earn a quiet harbor in your later years. I believe that. After losing my husband Thomas 12 years ago, I navigated a grief so thick it felt like I was learning to breathe a new kind of air. I rebuilt my world, piece by piece, not on the ruins of the old one, but on new ground entirely. I built a life of peaceful solitude, a fortress of quiet routines and simple contentment. But I've learned that the most dangerous storms aren't the loud, violent ones that tear you apart. They're the quiet, persistent ones that seep through the cracks, the ones that come disguised as love and concern from the people who are supposed to protect you. They whisper that your peace is actually loneliness, that your independence is a problem to be solved, and that quiet pressure, that slow erosion of your own certainty, can be the most devastating flood of all. My days have a rhythm, a gentle hum of purpose that I orchestrated myself. Mornings are for the library, where the smell of old paper is a kind of incense, and my job is to bring order to the wonderful chaos of stories. Afternoons are for my quilting group at the church. The steady push and pull of the needle, a meditation. Each stitch, a tiny anchor holding my world in place. My home is my sanctuary, a place that smells of me, of lemon tea, and the books piled by my armchair. It is the last stronghold of my identity. But this carefully constructed piece has become fragile. My daughter Susan, with all her love, sees my solitude as a failure. My friends, all happily coupled, look at me with a pity I don't feel for myself. Their voices have become a constant chorus of, "You should get back out there," a relentless campaign to fix a life I don't believe is broken. And after so long, their doubt has started to feel like my own. So, I did it. I finally agreed to meet someone, not from a place of want, but from a place of weariness, a desperate need to silence the noise. My days are built from small, sturdy things, the quiet hum of the library on a Tuesday morning, where I am the keeper of stories, straightening spines, and feeling the weight of 1,000 different lives in my hands. The rhythmic dip and pull of my needle at the church quilting circle, each stitch a tiny, deliberate act of creation. My friend Martha always says the patterns we make are like maps of our lives, and I suppose mine would be a very orderly one, full of soft colors and predictable lines. My home is the heart of this map. It's more than just walls and a roof. It's a living, breathing space that holds the scent of my life. Lemon tea brewing on the stove, the faint, dusty perfume of old books piled by my favorite armchair, the one Thomas never liked. This isn't emptiness, it is a carefully curated peace, a kingdom of one that I fought tooth and nail to build from the ashes of a shared life. Every quiet evening is a testament to my survival, a victory I refuse to see as a loss. But a kingdom, I've learned, is only as strong as its borders, and mine are constantly being tested. The phone rings, and I know it's Susan before I even look. Her love feels like a heavy blanket, warm but suffocating. "Mom, are you okay? You sound tired. Are you lonely?" The questions are always the same, a gentle interrogation designed to find a crack in my contentment. My friends at the quilting group, their lives so neatly paired off, look at me with a kind of gentle pity, as if my solitude is a disease they hope I'll recover from. Their whispers of "you should meet someone" have become a constant, low-grade fever in my life. For years I held my ground, but their certainty began to erode my own. What if they were right? What if this peace I cherished was just a pretty name for loneliness? The doubt became a small stone in my shoe, then a rock, until I couldn't walk without feeling it. Agreeing to meet this man, it wasn't for me. It was an act of surrender, a desperate attempt to finally make the noise stop. His name was Richard, and on paper, he was everything they promised. A retired history professor, widowed like me, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. Our first meeting was at a quiet cafe downtown, a place I'd never been to, which felt appropriate. I was stepping into someone else's world. He spoke about his travels, his late wife, his grandchildren, all with a practiced, gentle charm. I listened, nodding in all the right places, asking the questions a woman on a date is supposed to ask. But my mind wasn't really there. I was observing myself from a distance, watching a woman named Margaret play a part she hadn't auditioned for. I noticed the way his smile didn't quite banish the sadness from his eyes, the same way mine probably didn't. We were two lonely people performing a script written by society, and the silence between his sentences felt heavier and more anxious than any silence I had ever known in my own home. I drove home that night not feeling a spark of connection, but the hollow exhaustion of a long day's work. The first date bled into a second, then a third. The quiet erosion of my life began not with a bang, but with the persistent chime of my telephone. Richard was a caller. He called to say good morning, to ask about my day at the library, to say good night. Each ring felt like a summons, a small tear in the fabric of my peace. Then he started appearing. He'd show up at the library just to say hello, standing awkwardly by the checkout desk while I tried to work, his presence a disruption to the sacred quiet of the place. He'd bring me flowers, a gesture so publicly thoughtful that I felt a hot flush of guilt for my own internal recoil. My carefully guarded afternoons, once reserved for the meditative rhythm of quilting, were now punctuated by the need to check my phone, to be available. My body began to keep score. A tightness formed in my shoulders that wasn't there before. The deep, restorative sleep I cherished became shallow and restless. My home, my fortress, was no longer entirely my own. It had become a place where I waited for the outside world to intrude. The approval from the outside world was immediate and overwhelming, and it felt like being buried alive in kindness. Susan was ecstatic, her voice on the phone brimming with a relief so profound it sounded like she'd been holding her breath for 12 years. "Oh, Mom, I'm so happy for you. He sounds just perfect. I knew you just needed to put yourself out there." At my quilting group, the gentle pity in my friend's eyes was replaced with conspiratorial smiles and knowing glances. Martha patted my hand and said, "See, it's never too late." Their happiness created a cage around me. Every compliment, every encouraging word was another bar locking me into this new reality. How could I tell them that Richard's constant presence felt less like companionship and more like a low-grade fever? How could I explain that their relief was my anxiety? To voice my own feelings would be to shatter their joy, to prove myself ungrateful and broken. So I smiled, I nodded, and I let their version of my happiness become the only story I was allowed to tell. The breaking point didn't happen during a fight or a grand dramatic scene. It happened on a Tuesday night, after a perfectly pleasant dinner with Richard. He had walked me to my door, kissed my cheek, and left. I closed the door, leaned my back against it, and the silence of my own home rushed in to meet me. But it wasn't the comforting, familiar silence I knew. It was a different kind. It was the silence of a held breath, the quiet before a storm. I looked around at my living room, at the half-finished quilt draped over my armchair, at the tower of books waiting patiently on the side table, at the soft glow of my reading lamp. For the first time, I didn't see my sanctuary. I saw a territory that was about to be occupied. I saw everything I had fought to build, everything that held me together, and I felt a terror so cold and so absolute it stole the air from my lungs. This wasn't a new chapter. It was the end of my story. In my attempt to silence the world, I had invited an invader in, and I suddenly understood that he wasn't just going to take up space in my home. He was going to take up the space inside me. My body was the first to wave the white flag. A dull, persistent ache settled between my shoulder blades, a physical manifestation of the tension that now hummed beneath the surface of my days. Sleep, once my reliable refuge, became a shallow, restless affair from which I'd wake feeling not rested, but simply less tired. The constant anticipation of Richard's calls coiled in my stomach. At the library, I'd find myself glancing at the door, my focus shattered, the peaceful hum of the room replaced by a low-grade anxiety. He meant well, I told myself. He was just attentive, but his attention felt less like a warm light and more like a constant buzzing fluorescent bulb that gave me a headache. I started to miss the simple, profound comfort of a silence that was truly my own. The silence I shared with Thomas had been a living thing, a space we inhabited together. The silence with Richard was an empty space I felt compelled to fill, an anxious void that drained me more than any conversation ever could. I was becoming a stranger in my own skin, my carefully calibrated peace replaced by a weary exhaustion I couldn't explain to anyone. The guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to my every resentful thought. Each time his name flashed on my phone and my heart sank, a second wave of shame would wash over me. What was wrong with me? This was what I was supposed to want. This was the happiness Susan had so desperately wished for me. This was the solution my friends had prescribed. To admit that it felt like a slow poison would be to admit that I was fundamentally broken, incapable of accepting the very thing everyone else saw as a blessing. I would sit across from him at dinner, smiling and nodding, while an internal monologue of rebellion and self-recrimination screamed inside my head. You're being ungrateful. You're being selfish. This is what companionship is. And yet, in the quiet moments after he'd left, a terrible truth began to surface, a whisper I tried desperately to ignore. I had never felt more profoundly lonely than when I was sitting right next to him, performing the part of the happy, grateful woman who had been saved from herself. The solitude I had cherished was freedom. This companionship felt like a cage. My world, once as expansive as I wanted it to be, began to shrink until it felt like it was only the size of my living room, and even that was no longer entirely mine. It started with small things, little footholds of his existence in my sanctuary. A spare toothbrush appeared in my bathroom, a pair of his reading glasses on my nightstand, a coat he left in the closet just in case. Each item felt like a tiny flag planted on conquered land. My evenings, once a sacred time for reading and quiet contemplation, became a performance. I'd sit with my book open, my eyes scanning the pages, but my mind was elsewhere, listening for the sound of his key in the lock or the ring of the phone. The quiet rhythm of my life had been replaced by the unpredictable tempo of his needs. I found myself tidying up, not for my own comfort, but in anticipation of his arrival. My home, my last stronghold, was no longer a place of rest. It had become a stage, and I was on duty, waiting for my co-star to arrive, feeling the walls slowly, irrevocably, closing in around me. It was a Thursday evening, one of those quiet nights that used to be my favorite. We were sitting in my living room, the one that still smelled faintly of lemon tea and old paper despite his presence. He was telling a story about his time teaching in Boston, and I was nodding, smiling, playing my part. He reached across the small table between our armchairs and took my hand. His touch was warm, but it didn't warm me. "Margaret," he said, his voice soft and earnest, "this has been so good. Better than I could have hoped. I feel like we're wasting time, living in two separate houses, driving back and forth." I felt a cold knot begin to form in my stomach, a premonition that coiled like a snake. I knew, even before the words left his mouth, that the ground beneath my feet was about to give way. I kept the smile fixed on my face, a fragile mask I'd worn for months, but my entire body was bracing for an impact I couldn't see. "I think we should move in together," he said. The words didn't land like a happy suggestion. They landed like stones, each one hitting a different part of my carefully constructed piece and shattering it. The sound of the grandfather clock in the hall suddenly seemed deafening, each tick a hammer blow against my skull. I looked from his hopeful face to the half-finished quilt on my armchair, its familiar pattern suddenly looking like a map to a country I was about to be exiled from. I saw my mornings at the library, The sacred quiet of the stacks, being interrupted by a phone call asking what I was making for dinner. I saw my afternoons of silent stitching replaced by the noise of his television. In that single terrifying moment, the proposal wasn't an invitation to a shared future. It was an eviction notice from my own life. A wave of pure animal panic washed over me, so cold and so absolute that it felt like drowning. And in that panic, something broke. A dam of politeness and obligation and guilt that I had been building for months finally burst, and in the flood came the most profound, illuminating clarity of my life. I looked at this kind, well-meaning man, and I didn't see a partner. I saw an answer to a question I had never asked. I saw the physical embodiment of my daughter's anxieties and my friend's pity. I wasn't running towards companionship. I had been running away from their judgment. The exhaustion, the tightness in my shoulders, the sleepless nights. It wasn't the stress of a new relationship. It was my body, my very soul, screaming in protest against this slow, creeping invasion. The hard truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had never, not once, felt as lonely as I did when I was trying so desperately not to be alone. My solitude hadn't been a problem to be solved. It had been the solution. The guilt that had been my constant shadow simply vanished. It didn't fade. It was burned away in the heat of that revelation, replaced by a fierce, protective love for the woman I was before he walked through my door. A woman who knew the deep comfort of her own silence, who found purpose in the quiet rhythm of her days, who had fought her way out of the suffocating fog of grief to build this small, sturdy kingdom of peace. I gently pulled my hand from his. The smile on my face was gone, but for the first time in months, my eyes felt clear. I was no longer a participant in a story written by someone else. I was the author of my own, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was about to write the final chapter of this one. The performance was over. I had found my way back to myself, and I would not let anyone, no matter how well-intentioned, lead me away from home again. I told him that night. The words weren't angry or loud. They came out with a quiet firmness that surprised even me, as if they belonged to a woman I was only just getting to know again. I said, "Richard, this isn't going to work." I didn't offer a long list of reasons or excuses. I didn't blame him. I simply stated a fact that had become as solid and real as the floor beneath my feet. I watched the confusion cloud his kind eyes, followed by a flicker of hurt. A part of me, the part that had been trained for decades to be accommodating, felt a pang of guilt for causing him pain, but a much stronger part, the part that had fought its way back from the brink of grief, felt nothing but a profound, grounding sense of relief. I was no longer negotiating the terms of my own life. I was reclaiming it. In that moment, turning down his vision of a shared future felt like the first truly honest thing I had done in months, a necessary amputation to save the whole. It was the closing of a door, yes, but for me, it was the opening of a window, letting in the first clean breath of air I'd had in a very long time. The fallout was exactly what I expected, a gentle storm of disappointment I was now strong enough to weather. The phone call with Susan was the worst. Her voice, usually so bright and full of concern, was flat and heavy with a familiar kind of weariness. "Oh, Mom, I just don't understand. He was such a nice man." It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. I had failed the test she had set for me. For the first time, however, her disappointment didn't feel like a dagger in my heart. It felt like a stone skipping across the surface of a deep, calm lake. It made a ripple, but it couldn't touch the quiet depths. At my quilting group, the knowing smiles were gone, replaced by a careful, polite distance. They talked about their husbands, their grandchildren, their upcoming vacations, and the conversation simply flowed around me as if I were a rock in a stream. I felt their judgment, their silent consensus that I was the problem, the woman who couldn't accept a good thing. But instead of shame, I felt a strange and powerful sense of peace. Their world was no longer my measure. I had my own map now, The true moment of my return came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the profound silence of a Saturday morning, about a week later. I woke up slowly, not startled by the anticipation of a phone call or the need to plan my day around someone else's schedule. The sun was streaming through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air, and the only sound was the distant chirping of a bird. I lay there for a moment, wrapped in the familiar comfort of my own sheets, and I realized something extraordinary. My first thought of the day, the very first conscious idea that formed in my mind, was not about Richard or Susan or what anyone expected of me. The thought was simple, clear, and utterly my own. What do I want to do today? It was so small, yet it felt like a tectonic shift inside me. A whole continent of my own desires, my own rhythms, my own quiet joys had just drifted back into place. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't broken, I was free. And in the silent, sunlit peace of my bedroom, I finally understood that this freedom was the most precious thing I had ever owned. I learned something profound in the quiet that followed. We spend so much of our lives believing that happiness is something you find in another person, a missing piece that will finally make us whole. But after losing Thomas, I wasn't broken, I was just rearranged. I had painstakingly built a new shape for my life, a structure that could stand on its own, and I had learned to love its quiet strength. The great mistake wasn't meeting Richard, it was believing that my peace was a problem that needed solving. I came to understand that in the later chapters of life, your emotional energy is not a renewable resource. It is a precious, finite reserve. You can't afford to spend it on performances, on managing someone else's expectations, or on filling a silence that was never truly empty to begin with. The greatest act of love, I found, was not finding a new person to give my heart to, but fiercely protecting the quiet space where my own heart could finally rest. So I sit here now, in my quiet house, with the smell of old books and the hum of a life that is entirely my own. It is not a lonely existence, it is a sovereign one. True loneliness, the kind that hollows you out from the inside, isn't found in a silent room. It's found in a room with someone who makes you feel that your silence is an inconvenience, your peace a project, and your presence a performance. We are taught to fear the quiet, to see an empty chair as a tragedy. But I ask you to consider this. What if that quiet is a sanctuary? What if that empty chair is not a symbol of loss, but an invitation to finally sit with the one person who will always understand you, yourself? The greatest peace is not found in being chosen by another, but in finally, unapologetically, choosing yourself.